I celebrated my 50th birthday by being alone. After the family celebration, the joy of community, I took some time by myself. I went on a solo cycling trip last November, 2 months after my birthday. I had never done anything like it. In the airport on the way, I found a book to read, A Farewell to Arms by Ernest Hemingway. I had first read it 30 years before marriage, before kids, before becoming a rabbi. It was as if it were meant to be. For 5 days, I biked during the day under the sun, and at night read Hemingway, whose protagonist was always in the rain. I reflected on my life, the clear skies and the storms and the passage of time. I was grateful. And I felt privileged to have had that time alone, and thankful for my life, my family, and my community. 4 months later, a lifetime later, in March of this year, the word alone meant something completely different. Quarantine caused so many people to be alone, not by choice. But it was not a new challenge. It just became epidemic. So many people have not just been alone, but lonely for many years. Alone is a mathematical number. Loneliness is existential, and it is serious. At the very beginning in Genesis, God says, Lo tov heyot ha'adam levado, it is not good for us to be alone. The ultimate story in the Talmud about loneliness concerns a man called Choni Hama'agal, Choni the circle maker. The Talmud tells us that Choni fell asleep one night and did not wake up for 70 years. When he did and looked around, he discovered that everyone he had ever known was gone. He was utterly devastated. His pain was so intense that he prays for death to escape his intolerable loneliness. He says, O charuta, o metuta, give me companionship or give me death. COVID has upturned everything in our lives, but it is not the first time we have faced what many call the most pervasive public health threat in our time, loneliness. I remember being a teenager when my Rabbi, John Friedman, spoke about loneliness in the High Holy Days, and I could not understand how loneliness could be the topic of an entire sermon. Now I do. Standing here alone, I am haunted by the Beatles' lyrics. Father Mackenzie, writing the words of a sermon no one will hear. No one comes near. Eleanor Rigby died in the church and was buried along with her name. Nobody came. All the lonely people. Where do they all come from? Just a couple years ago, the United Kingdom appointed a governmental minister of loneliness to address this issue. Tracy Crouch was that minister of loneliness, and she said, no one should feel alone or be left with no one to turn to. Loneliness is a serious issue that affects people of all ages and backgrounds, and it is right that we tackle it head on. Our strategy sets out a powerful vision for addressing this generational challenge. By bringing together health services, businesses, local authorities, charities, and community groups, we will raise the awareness of loneliness and help people build connections to lead happier and healthier lives. On our side of the pond, America's Surgeon General, Dr. Vivek Murthy, went on a listening tour around the country after he left office in 2017. What he heard is the number one issue that plagued people across socioeconomic status and across race, gender, and age was loneliness. His book, published this spring, was prescient. It is called Together, the Healing Power of Human Connection in a Sometimes Lonely World. Dr. Murthy said in an interview this May, "We have the opportunity to use this moment to recenter our lives on people, and if we do that, then I believe we can come out of this pandemic more connected, more fulfilled, and more resilient than before the pandemic began." To be clear, this is not only about people who are living on their own. Loneliness is not necessarily about isolation. It is a subjective feeling that one does not have the social connections needed. That can be any one of us. It means missing community, and our need for other people is so individual and related to how introverted or extroverted we happen to be, among other factors. What is universal is that we do not often talk about it, even after the death of a spouse, or the end of a relationship, or never being in a relationship. Many feel ashamed to admit it. Like any book that names something that people are longing to discuss, Dr. Murthy has opened the floodgates. On a radio program, one caller called him about her daughter just home from college. Her quivering voice struggled to hold back the tears. Her daughter loved being with friends, but she started realizing that all of her relationships were one-sided. Nobody asked about her. And she confided to her mom that she was lonely and did not know what to do. Another caller was a middle-aged man. His best friend had died from cancer 10 years before. He hadn't talked to anyone about how hard it was to find a good male friend. Some callers talked about the loneliness that came after a painful loss. Others talked about how loneliness caused further pain through substance misuse and addiction. Many reflected that loneliness was hard to recognize in their loved ones because it masqueraded as anger or sadness or alienation. All of them agreed that loneliness affected physical health. And this is where we come in. The word congregation comes from the Latin for a place where people gather. In Greek, it is the same with the word synagogue, so too in the Hebrew with Beit Knesset. Synagogues came to be not so much for people to find God, who is everywhere, but for Jews to find each other. Lo tov heyot ha'adam levado, it is not good for us to be alone. During this pandemic, we have tried our best to counter physical distancing with social connections, but we must redouble our efforts to help those who are feeling lonely. This outreach can not only be by clergy, nor by a select group of congregants or staff, but by each one of us as one caring community. And for ourselves, we need to try to counter loneliness by finding strength even when we are alone, and for some, even when they are surrounded by family. The Rabbi of Sassoff urged, a human being who does not have an hour for oneself each day is not a human being. When we are alone, we can discover our inner strength. We can deepen our spirit. We can reflect, evaluate, meditate, and be renewed. Some of the most important moments in the Torah happen in solitude. Hagar cries out to God alone in her despair and saves her son and an entire people. Jacob prays alone on his journey to his family's homeland and then wrestles with an angel after the text says, Vayivater Yaakov levado, and Jacob was left alone. Joseph matures in his solitude in the pit and in the dungeon. Moses, by himself in the Sinai desert, discovers God. Kol demama deka, a still small voice alone strengthened and fortified Elijah, one voice representing all of us. This is the ideal, taking alone time to strengthen our spirit, but we may need help from others when it is not 1 hour alone, but all the hours. We also, no matter who we are, need our faith. Faith is not certainty about the future. It is the courage to live with uncertainty. It takes humility, not blind hope, to recognize that some things, perhaps many things, are out of our hands and we never know what change may be for the good. When you lean into that awareness, that is bitachon, trust. Bitachon is a mindset shift. It pulls you away from your ego and reliance on your efforts and recognizes that you are part of something much larger. This may be uncomfortable according to Rabbi David Jaffe. He writes, in our modern secular society, bitachon is a strange concept. It calls for giving up control and having faith in something outside of ourselves. In our ego-driven, can-do culture, bitachon can seem kind of like a cop-out, but it is hardly that. Our efforts are absolutely needed. We need to reach out to people who are lonely, and if we are lonely, to do what we can to feel connected. And we need to know our limits and to trust that it will be okay. In this coming year, Rabbi Jonathan Sachs counsels that bitachon, trust, is the most important trait that each of us, whether alone or with others, need to develop. On Rosh Hashanah, I said that our courage, our ometz lev, is needed now to act in significant ways. These 10 days since have only underscored that need. At the same time, there is a balance with trust and faith. It is not all up to us. Bitachon is the confidence that comes from knowing that you can rely on something that is not completely in your control. I find that having a mantra, something I repeat to myself, reminds me of what is important, what is in my control and what is beyond my control, what I need the heart strength to do and what I need the faith and trust to accept. One example is that whenever you feel loneliness or fear or anxiety rise up inside of you, you can recite to yourself the simple phrase, I am in good hands. See what that can do for your spirit, even if you don't feel it. It is a leap of faith, bitachon, that can have, a centering effect. Perhaps instead of a phrase, and that might not work for you, it could be a verse from Tanakh. One congregant is focusing on Isaiah chapter 30, verse 15. In returning and rest, b'shuvah v'nachat, you shall be saved. In quietness and in trust, your strength will come into being. Last Kol Nidre, I spoke of Ecclesiastes, of Kohelet, and his embrace of simcha, of joy, despite the futilities of life. Joy, he said, is different from happiness. It is an embrace of a moment that is possible even when it seems improbable and for sure challenging. Kohelet also speaks about loneliness, and he does so in very practical ways. He says two are better off than one, and a threefold cord is not readily broken. He echoes Genesis that it is not good for us to be alone. We need each other. We need community. We need to know that even when it is just our voice that we hear in our room, that there are other voices that are just as real, connected by invisible lines. We need the faith, the courage, the bitachon to hear it.
This is the sound of one voice, one spirit, one voice, the sound of one who makes a choice. This is the sound of one voice. This is the sound of one voice. This is the sound of voices too. The sound of me singing with you, helping each other to make it through. This is the sound of voices too. This is the sound of voices too. This is the sound of voices three, singing together in harmony, surrendering to the mystery. This is the sound of voices three. This is the sound of voices three. This is the sound of all of us, singing with love and the will to trust. Leave the rest behind, it'll turn to dust. This is the sound of all of us. This is the sound of all of us. This is the sound of one voice, one people, one voice, a song for every one of us. This is the sound of one voice. This is the sound of